democracy is a political system in which the people periodically, by majority vote at the polls, select their rulers. The rulers then have absolute power to make whatever laws they please by majority vote among themselves. In a constitutional republic, the people also, by majority vote at the polls, select rulers, who make laws by majority vote among themselves. But the rulers cannot make any laws they please because the Constitution severely restricts their lawmaking power. The ideal of a democracy is universal equality. The ideal of a constitutional republic is individual liberty. In this century, great strides have been made toward the goal of subverting our republic and transforming it into a democracy. The foremost tactic of the subverters is subversion of language. By calling America a democracy until people thoughtlessly accept and use the term, totalitarians have obscured the real meaning of American principles of government. Note the following passages from a recent article distributed by the New York Times News Service. Quote, "In the United States and in other leading democracies, recent years have seen perceptible growth in executive authority. As society becomes more equalitarian, it tends increasingly to concentrate absolute power in the hands of one single man. This is a voluntary surrender of a free people escaping from freedom to one autocratic master." End quote.
Wow. If that doesn't just about sum it up, that was FBI agent Dan Smoot back in 1966 talking about the way in which language has been used to subvert our constitutional republic and transform it into a democracy. Welcome back to the Rights Man podcast. Javier, great to have you with me.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and so, I think that clip is so succinct and really perfectly shows us exactly the nature of this beast that we are contending with. Especially the end, the New York Times article back in 1966 saying that we are voluntarily surrendering our freedom as a free people into totalitarianism, essentially.
It's pretty intense the way that it's been said so directly before, and the way it's been molded basically into what it is now. And you can see that obviously it takes a major effect on, the people, on the public. And I really do wonder, what exactly the climate was when he had this recording.
Yeah, and with the nature of how things have compounded and accelerated and changed so much since that time, it really makes you wonder exactly what was the zeitgeist at the time. What was the state of consciousness that the people had around knowledge of the constitutional republic and those principles, and just how far away from it we've gotten.
I don't think that most people did, because you would have to address problems in order to get to form a thing called a constitution, because it seems easy and apparent actually to just say everyone, yeah, I agree, everyone should have everything. But I think that there is like you say, zeitgeist, in that there is an intent that is to make everyone equal, but without the proper discrimination in place, in that by doing so, so many other problems come as a result. And that really the birth of that thought is one that it has a moral attitude, but one that doesn't have true practical, applications outside of, let's say, a household.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so just for everybody to wrap their heads around this, the main theme of this podcast is democracy is tyranny, and we're tired of pretending that it's not. And so we are exploring this idea that if you look in even Fox News and conservative media, very rarely do you find reference to the constitutional republic. You see the term democracy used over and over and over again.
Especially media.
There was one little reel that I made where I just, it was part of driving a point home about this distinction. And I just looked up our democracy in news for titles. And within 1 week, I was able to find 15 different articles that were all within the most recent week. I mean, so this term democracy is being hammered into people's heads over and over and over again. And so that clip that we just played at the beginning, it so greatly summarizes the entire concept, because a democracy, its main principle is equality, right? Equality of outcome, equality of resources, all of that, equality of swing or sway with your voting power. And the principles of a constitutional republic are based on principles. The same, from the outside looking in, you could say, oh, well, there's voting in each of them that's democratic. And you would be wrong, because in our system, we are voting for people to enact and protect the principles that are upheld by the Constitution. In a democracy, it's kind of a free-for-all. It's literally 51% versus 49%, or 99% against 1%. And it doesn't take much imagination to understand why that's so dangerous.
Yeah, I think the main thing here is property or ownership. And this is where people cross their hairs, because, what we do with our trust work, we're saying we don't want to own anything. And in a very similar fashion, democracy kind of, well, not even just democracy, but let's say Marxist thought is to abolish all private property in order for everything to be equal. But in order for these things to actually happen, everyone would indeed have to be nearly saintly in order for there to be no, let's say, transgression upon another person. And so, like I've always said before, like it's a cute idea, and it's there, and I've always had it. Yes, everyone should be equal. There is no question about it. But really, to put it to application, that's how we have people coming in with demanding, hey, give me basic needs. And then this is where it gets much more complicated, because then we have to start defining what each of these terms mean to each person. And then in a democracy, how long is that going to take to create some form of pool of data to try to figure out what's just and what isn't? And if it isn't, guess what happens? They just vote for something else. It's just this perpetuation of change of law based on a feeling. And it really isn't the law. It's imposters to be a law, because it goes through people with suits, and we call it legislation because it's a form of codifying this thing that really is common sense. But eventually, these things that are issues are us to deal with as individuals, personally and individually with others as citizens, and not let the government come and get involved with our problems.
Right. Yeah. And I think that for us to flesh this out, it's really interesting what you were saying before about how in a democracy, the idea, it sounds so nice. The idea of equality sounds so nice, and you're externalizing the responsibility for producing that kind of equality. But you look at the constitutional republic that we have, and what you see is gloriously enshrined right at the beginning, all men are created equal. So it's so ironic, because people think that by externalizing and collectivizing, putting that on the government to create the equality, rather than just protecting the inherent equality of mankind at law, how they are treated at law, it's perfect representation of the difference between taking individual responsibility versus placing that on an external authority. And every single time the external authority is given that kind of power, it ends in massacre and bloodbath.
I don't think a lot of people can't forget this, and it even made it into a Joe Rogan podcast. And Joe goes like, take a look at this, and maybe you've seen it, but it's gone viral semi on YouTube for a while now. But it's basically all the TV news reporters verbatim saying the same thing. And I think this was during the COVID time. Yep. And something, and protect our democracy.
Yep.
And it's like, really, they're the ones that have the greatest interest in having most people think that this is a democracy, because in doing so, it's easy to make big promises when you're in a position. And then really, to put it into practice, it's like, We don't know these people's characters. We don't know these things. That's why, you know, the principle of all people at the beginning being equal, in that each one has a separate interest that parallels each other, versus, you know, this trying to let's stop everyone from having a conflict. Where does that exist in nature exactly? It doesn't, you know. And there a lot of that idea, although it seems natural, is really very synthetic and very heavenly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I ended up using that clip as a part of one of our reels that we put out.
Oh yeah.
It was talking about similar to what we're talking about in this podcast. Kind of wrapped it up into a little reel, which if everyone hasn't checked us out on Instagram or TikTok yet, we produce some really great reels to, you know, bite-sized pieces that really hit home and drive some of these points home to people. And in that reel, I explained that there's a parallel here between our constitutional republic and democracy versus common law, what is right and true, versus statutory law. And in a way, the more we get convinced to abide by a democratic principle of rule, the more we get sucked into this policy, and the policy always changes in regards to public opinion. And
Emotional cycles, even.
exactly. And public opinion is always shaped by the media. So you can see exactly why it's such a powerful interest in brainwashing people essentially into accepting democracy as an enshrining principle of our society. They all they have to do is run a couple news segments, convince people that, you know, masks are for everyone's good, and all of a sudden majority of people think, well, a majority of us want the masks, so we should make that law. Well, that's not how law works. Your whims and your majority does not get to impose upon me as the minority just because you feel a certain way.
Yeah.
And that's the glory of the Constitution.
Yeah, it's like the same thing that they shove down people's, you know, mind, that is, the world's falling apart, these things are happening. And so there is this very subtle, yeah, I should just stay in my house. Yeah, I should just, you know, let things be out there, and kind of this almost submissive form of attitude towards this information, rather than actually discriminating at the point of where, you know, this is false or truth or whatever, you know how to deal with it, and then moving on. But there's just so many factors that include institutions that are very large that sway people's opinion. And not to discredit democracy and people's opinion, but people need to look, you know, they have to look to themselves and look at their own greed, look at their own level of desires, their own level of interest, before going out and judging others for asking for whatever. And I think that once we start to kind of see that turned around to us, then it becomes more practical to be like, well, yeah, everyone does, you know, should be equal, but it isn't some uniform way or systemic way that this is going to happen. That's crazy. And I think the early framers knew this. And even Karl Marx quoted the ancients. They were just philosophers. They didn't do anything practically. He would even agree with me that it's an action that does all these things. But later on, when the early framers, they understood that this action isn't the same. Everyone has completely different capacity, skills, and different, let's say, calls to action. And a lot of what is democracy and communism kind of leads to this, the proper term, I guess, is egalitarian, you know, utopia, in which there is one mind that basically says, this is what it is, and everybody else must agree. And if you don't, very much like the church, you're excommunicated. You know, oh, you're not one of us then. And it's happened way too much in history for us to realize that it is indeed more difficult to constrain ourselves, our desires, our own interest, than it is to try to impose that on our leaders and everybody else. So great attorneys understood this and they wrote it down. And I think that it was for a very good reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were kind of discussing some of these concepts beforehand, and it was funny coming to the conclusion that when you let the external authority define like, let's say we gave the authority to the government to provide all of our basic needs, right? All of
Yeah.
the people pushing for this think that basic needs are a simple 1-bedroom home on 1 simple acre with a simple wardrobe and a simple functioning vehicle. Well, as soon as you give that power to the government to determine what is necessary, basic necessity, they say, hey, your only basic necessity is a 1/4 cup of rice and this shovel, pick it up and get to work, all of a sudden, these principles that we think are so lofty and so wonderful end up in reality becoming very cold-blooded and ruthless.
Yeah.
And so that kind of brings us into the next section of this, which is and we've kind of touched on it a little bit, our understanding of this issue. What is the stark contrast between the democratic principle versus the constitutional republic, and how do we include that constitutional republic in our own day-to-day life, in our own applications?
Yeah, that's very, very super good, because we've spoken about this before too. Like, democracy works in certain, hey, I'm the dad of my household, right? Hey, who wants to have macaroni for lunch? Raise your hand. Okay, we go for that, But when we start to extend more variables, numbers of people, it becomes almost impossible for the information to be processed. And that information being what everybody feels is fine, because ultimately it becomes a breakdown of what terms mean. And it's very difficult to try to delegate that to attorneys, because they'll sneak in other implications that you didn't have, that you had originally with the intent. And what's interesting is, when the nation was being built, I knew that at some point, when the early framers were doing this, they weren't intending some perfect capitalist utopia, right? They were reasonable. They weren't selling that everything's going to be perfect. If you buy the United States stock, it's just going to go to the moon if you come with us. No, it was, we don't have all the pieces, but let's look at everything that we've built philosophically, right? What's our philology? What's the history? What is the history of government? And essentially put this into a framework in which it's a little bit of both. But it's interesting, because once the emphasis, and really a lot of the difference, is feeling, and the feeling that's in the US about democracy is wrong. A lot of it is wrong, because it's charged with feeling rather than like analytics and just technicalities, and seeing it as a part of history and as a part of an application that you experience in real life with others. And you're like, hey, it does have a place. And so is with capitalism. Hey, it has its place, but then we also see when it becomes too sour, right? We see the perfect example as a Federal Reserve, right? And then when you go to the grocery store, you go to your aisle and try to get a little bit of oatmeal, and you find 52 different cereals. You're like, well, I'm not sure if that demand actually exists. And then again, you're led to be pointed to the decision of who we are, like our own desires, our own intention, our own interest, because really the public market, and this is why capitalist thinkers, we leave it to the public market, because at some point it's going to pass. This feeling, whatever it is going to pass. And once it does passes, people are going to realize, oh, I really don't need 52. And I don't just want one cereal. I'd like somewhere in between. And the public, after some time, reasonably will adjust itself, and you're going to see it, because as soon as a cereal comes out and it's $14, I'm not buying that. But if there's one that comes down, it's 50 cents and it's absolute trash, I'm not buying that either. So this goes to show that there's at least a legitimate respect economically with services and demands. But this charging of the feeling is, I think, what pulls both sides to really see themselves completely different. And they're really not. I think that the only thing that's super similar is the way that they're both being manipulated into construing false appearances of what each party is to one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and that there's the feedback loop there where people are not being shown the alternative. We're not being taught about the constitutional republic anymore, and therefore there's people marching in the streets, protect democracy, don't threaten our democracy. So in a way, and it's similar to the cereal analogy in that General Mills, I would feel like, is such a behemoth, BlackRock company at this point, that they can kind of the capitalism has gotten so out of control and so unified and frankly fascist that they don't necessarily have to respond to the market in the way that you and I do as small businesses. They can kind of manipulate and inflate and deflate and falsely prop up, and
that's true. That's why we can have like 7 McDonald's in one block, because they're like, we're conflating based on our loans and our figures and our interest, all this, that there is a demand that is actually completely false. It's monetary, but now there is this appetite to fulfill this vacuum. And that's the other thing in building a business that isn't capitalist at all, actually. It's the exact same thing. It's that you have a feeling or a desire. And same with the consumer. Aren't all businesses just feeding what consumers want? And aren't consumers themselves supposed to mitigate themselves, right? My wife and I, we watch a little bit of Parks and Recreation, and the genius character Ron Swanson, right?
Yeah.
He's like, hey, we're free. I want to be in America where if I want to be able to eat 1,000 burgers and kill myself, I should be able to do that. And this is one of the things that I alluded to in the previous conversation, because it's like, if we want people to be free, they have to be able to also make errors. But once you get into a democracy, the threshold for their liberal attitude becomes less and less and less, and kind of alludes to, what the title of this podcast is, which is essential, self-annihilation, because there's this continuous identification with a group that's constantly shifting and changing.
Right. And yeah, there's this deep fundamental aspect of this conversation and this concept where you mentioned it right away in the beginning, which is that if we are looking to the outside, some sort of external system to produce or affirm our equal nature or produce some sort of equality, then it's always going to give us this promise and vicious, terrible outcome, this glorious promise and this terrible outcome. But the other side is that when we internalize and we base our life on principles, and we ourselves internalize that equality and see everyone as equal to us and figure out how to relate to others based on those principles, then the best possible outcome comes through that. And it's really sad. A lot of these people, in my opinion, that are falling hook, line, and sinker for the quote unquote democratic rhetoric are those who are seeking a higher thing. They don't realize that there is a divine principle, perhaps, to their reality that is missing.
We all want the same thing. They're just taking a little bit of a different route.
Right.
And it's more, emotional based, I would say, because it's very reactive rather than considerate.
Right. And there's, a really interesting thing that came to mind there is that when you seek after God, essentially, and you ask God to take on the burdens that these people are asking the government to do, again, that is acceptable and that produces really, really positive outcomes. But most people don't conceive of anything beyond the physical world. And because of that, the state literally has become their God. And wittingly, unwittingly, somewhere in the middle for most people, they are approaching the state as if it is God and don't see the irony or the drawback to living that way.
Yeah, there's a really interesting connection there between, this innate nature for desire and the supplication of that of fulfillment. And we either get it from our parents, or we get it from God, or we get it from the government. And I'll say we also get it from our public school system or whatever, but it's like these are the only things that the average person has to kind of go through this and decide, what's the stance, but like I said before, everyone wants the same thing. but they're looking at it a little bit differently. And I always see it as it's almost like a type of spiritual orientation, rather. It's like, hey, I'm in this type of position asking, and if there is any lack, it's on me, right? It's not on anything or anybody else. If lightning strikes tomorrow, it's not on anybody but me even. And if there is a discharge of a responsibility there that doesn't exist anywhere else. In democracy, it's going to be one guy. It's going to be one person that's going to be ended up being a totalitarian form of dictatorship. It's going to be some person that is eventually going to plead and ask, and his desires better be the exact same as yours, even if they're foolish. You're going to do, right? Let's go ask how North Korea is doing, because this is exactly this. Well, if he feels, then we also have to feel. And there is no way around that. And if we look back at our common law principles, our constitutional republic, it says we have the liberty to go across and do any form of seeking of happiness, as long as we don't conflict with another interest or some form of public policy. And this is where it's like there is that common ground. But what's crazy is that it's gone from, hey man, I have a problem with you, bro, and and I need you to, and in the good days, I'd just come to you and say, hey, there's this invoice, I have this problem with you, and I need you to settle. We need to settle. Nowadays, it's wah, someone give me money. Wah, someone give me something. Someone right this wrong. And that is almost calling for some divinity, right? Some godlike source power to correct some subjective emotional wrong that you basically instituted in your own imagination. And somehow California or any state has to pay you because it's not sunshine every single day. Who is going to pay? And to live that way is exhausting. It's exhausting. So I rather, in order to preserve and conserve my energy, I put it all on God and on me. And this way, there is legitimately more to give, because we're not relying on everybody else. Rather, we're in a very unique way relying on the strength of each other rather than the weakness and limitations of each other. It's completely different ways, I think, of looking at the world. And if I may, I had this screenshot that I made because this also summarizes the general feeling of today's, kind of democratic tone. And this type of video keeps getting pushed around to try to show how horrible capitalism is, without actually seeing the principles attached. Because of course, human beings are not perfect. So why are we attributing perfection to a thing that is admittedly already not perfect? But rather, communism is supposed to be this perfect thing, and there's errors all over, and they won't forgive us for it. But it was a screenshot, and it says, to insinuate that the fulfillment of basic needs for all people would destroy their incentive to work is simply an admittance that the entire capitalist system is based on coercion or form of slavery. These people think they're smart too, and that they're this, this moral position because you can simply point, and my response to this is childish. This is a child who's been told that if he complains, he can make a wrong a right. And it's also with this attitude in that as long as we all agree that it's that person, then we're all part of the same club. And if you don't agree that this is our boogeyman, then we can't really associate with each other, because I am identifying a really strong problem that I'm even conflating to be identical to who I am and my person. It becomes a weapon, because eventually this emotion is mistranslated continuously over and over and over